Well, today we're going to have a little bit of fun. I don't think we'll be here all that long, but I do have some stories I can tell about some of these. And I'm going to jump into this thing right quick and let's see how we do. What do you see here? 10 seconds left. Look at that camber. That's what I saw when I looked at it. 10 seconds. What do you see here? What we have here is the reason that I can still see out of both eyes. There was a girl grinding at the bench there, and I was standing there wearing these safety glasses, prescription safety glasses, and I didn't even realize that something had hit that safety glass lens right there in front of my eye. I'm talking about right in front of the pupil, until I was noticing that there was something there that I couldn't clean off. And I took them off and looked at it, and I was probably standing 6 feet away from her when she was doing that grinding. She was wearing safety glasses too. But just think about that. You just walk up to the bench while she's grinding, and something comes off of there with enough speed to chip a chunk out of that plastic of those safety glasses, polyurethane or whatever it is. But one way or another, the safety glasses, I went to see about getting the I'd had them a couple of years, so the scratch warranty had expired, and I says, well, could I just buy another lens? And she says, well, you don't want to do that because the lens for that pair of safety glasses is $300. And I thought, I'm wearing a $600 pair of safety glasses. This is ridiculous, you know. All right. This is a workable solution that I came up with. I actually illustrated it a little better than I have before. What you got is you got your flywheel with all the needles going out of here. You got to get this thing out of here. I mean, I'm sorry, your pilot bearing in the end of the crankshaft. You got to get this shell out of here so you can put a new, and putting the new one in there is not that difficult. Of course, you got to be careful, and it's got a seal where it seals the grease in. You got to put it in there the right way and all that. But so this guy that had been to Nashville Auto Diesel College, it was working with me. He was saying, how do I get this out of here? You know, it was just basically a shell like that, and it was this part of this rim or this was broke off, but I went ahead and ground a carriage bolt like that so that I could put it in there and hook it on both sides, and then I got a socket, and I got a washer, and then I got a nut. And whenever I put a little grease on those threads, and you turn that nut, and it just gently drags that thing out of there. Now, if you piddle around with a chip and a punch and all that kind of stuff, breaking that thing out of there, you got big trouble. I mean, it's just a nasty, aggravating mess. This thing is really hard and really brittle, and you just make a mess trying to get it out of there unless you do it the right way. Now, they do make tools you can buy for this, but at the time, I didn't have one, he didn't have one, and so I just went ahead and came up with something, and that's, it worked. Now this is a trash trap that we don't often think about. This stuff can go all the way through the condenser, just go right through the condenser and then get trapped in front of the radiator. And you won't know it's there until you take this rubber off, or if you take the radiator loose and lean it a little bit so you can see down in there. Look at all that crud. And what happens is, whenever it happens, you say you start out with zero pressure here, all right? So this is what it looks like, what it's supposed to look like whenever it's running. See, you got about 30 here, and you got a little over 200 here. It depends on the ambient temperature, because it's not going to be the same regardless of your temperature. If it's colder weather, both these numbers will be lower, and this will be short cycling. If it's hotter weather, this number will be higher, and that one, and it won't cycle at all usually, unless you got it on low blow and max AC and all that. But if you see one that's got really high pressure here, and it's way over in here, and and it's trying to even sometimes blow the pop-off valve, or it's cycling it off on an R134 system that's got high pressure cutout, or the fan's running all the time, you need to be looking at this. Not only this, but you can have a lot of dirt and dust and crud stopping up the radiator. The radiator, it tends to stop this stuff more than the condenser does. And so just be aware of that. It's always a good place to look whenever you've got a high head pressure problem where there's not good AC cooling. Of course, you need to know the fan's operating too, and that's another story. Now, if you don't center a new steering unit, and this one right here was one that we got. I don't remember if this one here was a one that they brought us from a salvage yard, if I'm not mistaken. It's or something. But one way or another, if you're changing out this unit and you don't center the original one, and then you got to set the new one you're putting in there in the center, then you're going to destroy the clock spring. I had a student that did that. He had his wheel turned all the way one way when he pulled his steering gear out in his little Honda, and then when he put the new one back up in there, it was centered. And so whenever he turned the wheel, he hit the end of what this spiral spring could handle, and it just ripped it all to shreds. And it was a $400 part. Some clock springs aren't that high. I have bought clock springs for like a 98 Ranger for like $35. But some of the foreign ones, and if they got other stuff with them, they're super expensive. So just be aware of the fact that you center this steering rack, you center it, lock the wheel. And then you center the other one the same way when you put it in there so that you don't have a great big surprise. Now this president of the college had bought a 75 GMC Sprint, and he wanted us to recondition the engine, make it look pretty. So we pulled the valve covers and the intake manifold off, and we cleaned them up really, really good. If you want to paint valve covers without having the paint come off, here's how you do it. You're going to take your valve cover that you've cleaned all the way down to the bare metal and sanded it really good and got all the dust off of it and everything. Maybe wiped it down with some lacquer thinner to make sure there's no greasy fingerprints on it. And then you're going to heat it up with a heat gun so that it is so hot, the metal is so hot that it will burn your fingers if you touch it. And then you're going to mist a coat of your orange paint or whatever color paint you're going to do on it. You mist that paint on those things, and let that paint bond to that hot metal. I mean, that works better than primers, believe it or not. Of course, you can prime them too. But I did that. I learned that on working on forklift engines. I had painted the valve covers on a forklift engine. I'd rebuilt a Perkins engine, and the paint cracked up and peeled off the valve cover before very long. And I mentioned something to the parts house guy, David Hughes at Spence Battery there in Port Arthur, about it. And I said, David, this is aggravating. I need to do some primer or something. He said, well, and he told me, he says, clean it up real good, make sure there's no grease or anything on it, and then heat it up super, super hot. Even if you use a acetylene torch, evenly heat it, and it needs to be evenly heated, and just mist a little paint on there, and then follow up with your final coat of paint. When I did that, that paint never came off those valve covers again. So you might remember that if you're painting valve covers. Of course, primer works good too, so I'm not hating on primer here. But as a little story here, it was kind of funny. I could probably illustrate this later, but those Perkins engines, those Perkins diesel engines in those forklifts had, if you take the cover off the end where all the gears were, off the end of the engine, there were several gears in there that had to be timed, and there was a big gear in the middle that had timing marks. It was actually basically a big idler gear, and it had timing marks here, there, and yonder, that had to be lined up. They wouldn't line up but one way, but so you had to make sure all those gears were lined up. It was a helical cut gear, and it would go in there and all that. And so one time the shop foreman guy that was over me decided he was going to send one of those engines over to the Perkins dealership on Interstate 10 and have that engine rebuilt. And I said, okay, that's fine. I've rebuilt those engines, but go ahead and send it over there. So he sent it over. They sent it back, put it in the forklift, fired it up, and it just about shake your teeth out. And I said, man, this is a disaster. This guy didn't time those balance shafts. This is ridiculous. So he called the guys. They charged us a massive amount of money to rebuild that engine. And the guy that they sent over there, I said, you need to pull that cover off. You're going to need to time those gears because they're not timed right. And he looked he kind of turned pale, and he rubbed his face and, took his glasses off for a second. And he said, I don't know how to time those gears. And I thought, what? We had done a bunch of them there where I was, and he sent the engine somewhere else to get it rebuilt. Whatever. I showed the guy how to time the gears, and everything was smooth again, so it was nothing ventured, nothing gained. Now this is when a rookie plugs in something and bends those pins, and then it won't start, and he doesn't know why. You know, there was this guy one time that had been working on a Jeep over there. You know, some of these people they hired to work at some of the dealerships were downright scary, the work they give them to do. And so what they did was they said, he put it all back together, and he was sitting there trying to start it, and he'd spin it and spin it and spin it, and he'd spin it and spin it and spin it. He was just sitting there, you know, looking with a dumb look on his face. And I said, hey, it's not going to start. Why are you still spinning it? And so he went and we went and investigated the crank sensor, and this wasn't a picture of that one, but he had bent the pins plugging the crank sensor in, and they had no crank signal. These Mercedes E320 mounts were fluid filled. She could feel it when she put it in reverse. It was shaking the car. And so these are a bear to change. You got to pull part of the exhaust system down and all that and raise the motor up. Got it done. We managed to get these from the parts store for like $60-something a piece, I think, or something. But anyway, this was the one that collapsed, and this was the one that we put on there. This is, you know, supposed to be this one should look like this one. That's the point. That's the student holding them both in there. Now, it's a really good idea before you put an engine back in, if it's an older vehicle particularly, to replace the pump seal. You know, they call it front pump seal, the torque converter seal, whatever. Because if you don't, you know, this torque converter, you know, that seal is, if it's a little bit hard, and then you pull the engine out and the torque converter is hanging on that seal and distorting it, and you spend all your time working on the engine to put it all back in there, you might wind up with a transmission fluid leak that wasn't there before. So it's really smart to go ahead and use your seal puller, pop that seal out of there and put another one in there. And that's just the smart thing to do. All right, so anyway, just word for the wise there. Now this right here is the stator support, and that's the turbine shaft. And there's that little another shaft that goes back in there to the intercomponent. I don't remember what kind of transmission that is. Some of your GM transmissions have after you put the seal in there, to keep the pressure from blowing the seal out, they got this other thing that you snap over it that kind of bites into the metal around it and all that. If you leave that off, it'll have to blow that seal slam out of there. All right, this is an odd, seldom used tool. I was at several shops over the years, and I would see these things. The shops where I went would have one laying around somewhere, and I would think, what the Sam Hill is this? And then one day, and my buddy Donnie, he was the same way. He'd seen a bunch of these and didn't know what they were used for. But basically, what you're supposed to use is this ball nut. On these, if you've ever rebuilt one of these steering racks, this one's power steering, because see, it's got them Teflon seals and all. This was manual steering, but that's what a ball nut looks like, and it recirculates those balls. It's not like regular threads, you know. It's a whole lot easier and more durable, and the balls have got lubricant around them and all that kind of thing. But what you're supposed to do on this is you're supposed to, before assembling the rack and the housing, ball retainer J21552, that's the part number, 21552, must be inserted into rack to allow removal of worm. So that was basically what that amounts to, and it keeps those balls from falling out of there, is what it amounts to. You push this out with a worm, push the worm out with this, and the balls are stay in place. Now, I used to have my students to take these steering boxes apart and, you know, put all those balls back down in there and all that kind of stuff. And it's annoying. You can do it, and a bunch of them did it. But after a while, I quit doing that, because nowadays you just go call a parts store and you order a steering gear and pop it on there. One time I had a Mustang I worked on. I took the steering gear apart, called myself going to rebuild it and reseal it and all that kind of stuff. And somehow I managed to get the little spool valve in there out of adjustment. And when it was in like a 72 or 73 Mustang, you know, like they're going in 62nd, when I think that was a 73 Mustang. Anyway, whenever you crank it up, the wheel would turn all the way to the right and lock. Because the spool valve, I could not get that spool valve timed, or there was a leak in there or something. So we went ahead and got another steering gear and put in that one. But I learned at that particular point that you can get in trouble if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you know, and I didn't want to play that game anymore. Some of the Ford OHC V8 tools. It doesn't do any better than that. Time and changed into 5.4, and this is the girl that did it. Her and McBride. McBride deserves a little bit of credit anyway, doesn't he? Alright, so looks good, runs good, sounds good, and
We weren't even sure if it had any other problems, but the guy wanted to do the timing chains. So we got new timing chains, new cam phasers. We got a little bit invested in this, but it turned out to be a really good job. 2005 F-150 5.4 3-valve. Got new plugs in it too. We would have been dumb not to put new plugs in it.
That was the last big job that girl did before she graduated. And she's pretty competent, you know, in what she was able to do. You really need a tool like this to get those roller rockers out of there. And it's you know, you squeeze that valve spring down, a roller rocker comes out. And if you pull all the roller rockers out when you're putting all this back in place, it's very easy to time these gears if you've got the roller rockers out of there, so the camshafts aren't fighting you trying to, you know, spring against, you know, all that kind of stuff. This positions the crankshaft. That's an important tool too to have. And so there's some of these, well, like on some of your Explorers, you don't have any timing marks at all anywhere on the crank gear or on the cam gears. And the cam gears, you got to locate the crank, then you got to lock the camshafts in where they're supposed to be, and you take the roller rockers out of those, but they're not quite as difficult as these to come out. You don't have to have a special tool. And once you get everything in place and you lock those, you know, you got special tools. I've got a video I actually made about that one time long years ago, probably one of the first instructional videos I ever made. But anyway, so this timing chain deal she did turned out really well. Thread repair made easy. Whenever you wipe those threads out, to begin with, and I've mentioned this before, when you're drilling these things out, make sure if you have to drill one out, that you turn the drill really slow and you apply good pressure and you keep it lubricated, because if you spin that drill fast, it takes the temper out of the bit and it tempers the bolt you're trying to drill, and you stop being able to cut anything. It took me a few years to learn that, but that's the deal if you do it right. You got a special tap that comes with your helicoils, and you tap it out. It's basically going to be a size bigger, and then you use this tool, you see how it's made on the end, to screw those in. And you notice these things are scribed right there. After you screw it all the way in, you break that little thing off, and it just snaps off, and you got you some good threads in that hole. And that's the best way to do that. When I was working at that truck shop back in the 80s, there was this guy that was another one of the mechanics, and I barely knew the guy. I didn't know much about him other than the fact that he knew how to twist bolts, but there was a lot of stuff he needed to know that he didn't know. And he was rebuilding a small engine that the boss had given him to rebuild, and it had an aluminum connecting rod, and the threads were stripped out on one side of that connecting rod, on the, you know, where the cap bolts up. He was getting ready to put it together like that, and I said, you can't do that. It'll throw a rod before, you know, it runs 10 minutes. So we went ahead, and in my toolbox I had some 6mm helicoils and stuff, and the tools to put them in there. We went ahead and helicoil that and fixed that and averted a disaster. You know, he was about to make a mess. Making the Chevy CSFI better, the old poppets, they had the solenoids up in here, and they would let those bursts of fuel pressure go down there and operate these little, you know, through those plastic lines and operate those little poppets. But some smart aleck came up with the idea, why don't we just build a whole new unit and run wires down to these injectors and put regular injectors down there that are shaped and will fit right in there. And you can buy a kit like this for a CSFI Chevy for like $114 from Amazon. But anyway, my dad had this, well, my son's driving that truck now. It was a 96 model that had this system in it. But I've talked about this before. When you pull that intake off, you got to pull the distributor out. When you put the distributor back in there, you better use your cam retard offset setting, or you can go into the cam sensor with a LED right there where it goes into the PCM, if you want to call it that. And the thing is, whenever you set your crank sensor, your crank, you got to measure to see 42 degrees after, 42 millimeters after top dead center is 24 degrees. And so, you got to do some gymnastics to figure that out. And I put a piece of masking tape on it so that I could turn it to 42 millimeters after top dead center, and that would be 24 degrees after. When you get the crankshaft right there, if you turn that distributor back and forth watching your LED until that LED is switching right there at that point and lock it down, you'll have it right. If that rotor alignment is wrong, because you got a crank sensor on this one and you got a cam sensor, turning the distributor doesn't change the timing, it just changes rotor alignment and makes the cam sensor be out of sync. And so what happens there is, if it knows that it can't trust the cam sensor, it will actually start bank firing these injectors and make them have terrible fuel economy. And so there's things you have to know. This didn't last very long. It was only out there for a few years and they replaced it. And most people were glad when they did, because these things were annoying to work on. Fuel pressure regulator was in there, and it was just I don't know why it even had a nipple on it, but it would basically regulate the fuel pressure, because see, that was trapped underneath this shell. You know, it was vacuum here. That's why you got an O-ring here. Anyway, I could go on about that for a while. This is funny to me how some of these DIY people get it comically wrong. Now, this thing was running okay and everything, but what they did was they didn't have a belt routing diagram, and they were just putting the belt on there any way they could possibly think of that it might work. I've seen that before. There was a Cadillac that came in there, and the belt was routed, so that it would work, but it wasn't routed right. If somebody gets lucky piddling around, they keep trying it. That's a pretty tough person there. But obviously, it was not supposed to ride the back of the belt. Anyway, I took a picture of that because I thought it was interesting. But there was one Dodge van, and I don't even know if this is feasible or not. They told me it was running too cool, and I said, well, it's just about got to be the thermostat. It was running too cool. And he called me back and says, no, it wasn't the thermostat. The belt was routed wrong. And I thought, how's that going to make it run too cool? I mean, maybe I was, he didn't have cabin heat. And he said that's all it took. Of course, on a Dodge Caravan, you don't have a metal impeller. It's plastic, So it didn't rust away. Of course, that would have, I don't know, just very strange. Now, this full fluid flush is always best to do. There's Bobby doing one. Bobby was a veteran of the military. But anyway, what you had to do before you connected these two lines, you connected this between the transmission line and in other words, you're going to connect it here. Okay, so the fluid is going to have to go through the machine, and then, the dirty fluid will go into a tank on the machine, the clean fluid would come out of another tank. But before you could connect these, there was a valve here that would let this fluid just flow, right? And these were clear hoses. So what you would do is connect these up, fire it up, and see which way the fluid was going. Once you saw which way the fluid was going, then you knew how you were supposed to hook this up. Dirty oil, clean oil. And then you would close that valve in the middle, and so the dirty oil coming out would go into the machine. The clean oil would leave the clean oil tank and come back in here. Now, we would always, if it held, like, for example, 13 quarts, like some of the, transmissions would hold this much. Let's use that for a number. I would run 16 quarts through it to make darn sure that I had replaced all of the fluid in there, because it leaves the torque converter, because that's where the heat's generated. It goes through the cooler, goes back into the pan, and it gets picked up again. See, that's how it keeps it cool. All the heat in an automatic transmission is created in the torque converter anyway. Okay, but anyway, after we did that, we'd pull the pan off and we'd do a regular service. Now, it took quite a bit of fluid to do that, but we fixed several vehicles by doing that procedure, and that's all we did. We did a full fluid exchange, and we did the fluid and filter, and wash the pan out, put a new gasket on, and all that kind of stuff. And that's just the slickest way to fix some of them without having to go in there and tear it down and all that kind of thing. Now, Harbor Freight's up their game a little bit. They got some very sensible tools that you can buy pretty good. They got some pretty high quality scan tools over there too, if you hadn't looked lately. Got a whole bunch of different grades of those, and they got a super expensive scan tool. It's like $1,700, and it actually has access to a library of I think wiring schematics and TSBs and all kinds of stuff. I bought a Zurich scan tool from there that I use. It's got the Ford style power balance test on it, which is really handy. And then I got another one that I bought, you know, just to horse around with. But this engine support fixture is very simple, very easy to use. You can adjust these in and out because this is a slot right here. I don't know if you noticed that or not. And so whenever you see how simple that is, you got this right here slotted, and this right here is got a little bit of a well, it swivels right there, so it's going to sit, you know, perfectly level all the time. And it seems to me like when I bought that thing, I don't remember. The students were pulling a transmission out of one and on that Pontiac there, but I don't remember what I paid for this doggone thing. It seems to me like it wasn't all that expensive, but it was perfectly functional. And I was telling my guys, I said, when you're getting started, you do not need a little toolbox you can carry in one hand from Snap-on that costs $3,000. That's ridiculous. What you need to do is, if I was just starting out, I'd hit Harbor Freight real hard, because you can get tools that will do the job at Harbor Freight when you're just starting out, and it won't hurt a doggone thing. And of course, you know, I never was terribly loyal to Snap-on. I'm not hating on Snap-on, but one of my really highest quality, incredibly accomplished Ford Senior Master technicians that I graduated from my program, he told me, and he does a lot of work. I mean, he works lots and lots on lots of vehicles. He said, you know, the tool kit that we would get him was a Craftsman kit back in the day. That had it was a roll-around toolbox. It had most everything in it that they need starting out. And so he had that set of tools, but he added to it, and he has a huge, gigantic toolbox now, and he's got a lot of Snap-on tools. And he says these Snap-on 8mm and 10mm sockets wear out and have to be replaced about once a month. He says these Craftsman sockets, 8 and 10mm, I have never worn a single one of them out. And at that time he'd been in the field 20 years. And that was just totally astonishing, you know, that the Snap-on ones had to be, they'd wear out and slip, as, you know, start rounding stuff off, because they just, you know, of course you got grit on the bolts and all that stuff, and it sort of grinds the stuff away. This is a 69 Deuce. There's a guy here in town that drives this thing. I think that's a cool looking ride. Imagine he probably gets about 8 miles to the gallon on a good day, because it's going to have a 455 with a quadrajet on it. But I imagine he probably drives it real careful. So he's even got some curb feeler back there, you know. So anyway, I've seen that thing around town even now. I think it's a cool ride. This right here was a ball joint that failed suddenly, and I'm talking about, and when these fail, they usually fail when you're turning, slowing down to turn, and it's putting a lot of pressure on it. It popped that thing off right there. And we had seen that, I'd seen that first time I ever saw that happen. When I was working down in Texas, we used to take one of the company trucks, and we had a 30-minute lunch hour. We'd drive down to the cafe at the intersection, and we'd go in there and eat, and we'd rush back down to the shop, and everybody'd go back to work. And we were driving this white 78 Dodge truck. We had a big metal bumper on the front of it for pushing stuff. And the truck, you know, had some miles on it. It had been bouncing around on the dock and stuff like that. But we drove that thing down there, bouncing through potholes and everything all the way down to the cafe. Drove it bouncing through potholes all the way back. And the boy that was using it to go grease the cranes took it and greased the cranes. He came back into the shop, and when he's pulling into the shop, about the time he hit the brake, one of the ball joints popped. And the bumper on that truck, because of the way that ball joint was set, boom, that bumper hit the ground like a ton of bricks, scared the daylights out of everybody. And then I look at that ball joint, and it was cracked about halfway through, but there was no way you could detect that just looking at it, unless you actually took it out of there and said, that made you want to know should I replace the ball joints, you know, every 60,000 miles or something. But if that had happened when 4 of us guys were in that truck driving down there to have lunch, it would have killed us all probably. And it's scary as all get out to have a ball joint come apart like this. And they had it dragged over here and rolled, all floated behind the shop, and I got out there and, you know, jacked it up and put a stand under it and put another ball joint in it and fixed it and all, you know. Had to put the CV axle came apart. I got them another CV axle and put in there too. What do you see here? I just thought it was really interesting here. They just kept on driving this thing long after the little park brake hat's still here, but the part of the disc that's Rear brakes is
All
gone.
right, let's watch this.
All right, look at this. This is a nice little deal. Whoa, look at a little. I think I've shown you that video before, but I think it's so cool.
All right.
And watch the action. This 4.8 liter Chevy had lack of power, and one of my students heard something under the valve cover. I mentioned that a while back, and so we couldn't really feel any, thing definitively wrong. But the guy that was driving it said it just doesn't run like it used to, and so we took this dial indicator and we set it on top of the push rod. And we turned the, zeroed the dial indicator, and we turned the engine through and measured how much movement we had here, because that's going to tell us how much cam lift we got, or how valve lift we got. And the valve lift on that thing, the cam, as far as how much it was supposed to, operate this side of the rocker arm. Now, this is not an equal distance from here to here. It's farther from here, and the spring is closer, but the long and the short of it is, it was supposed to have 250 thousandths lift on that 4.8, as I remember. You might want to look that up. But this one here only had like 210 thousandths, so it was beginning to wear a lobe off a camshaft. It wasn't skipping on that cylinder. I don't know. We didn't measure them all, but he was here, and the lifter was trying to take up the slack periodically. And one of my students had a really sharp pair of ears, and he could hear something clicking under that valve cover, and that's what we found. We did a plug-and-play 5.3, just got a 5.3 and popped it in there, and you don't have to reprogram anything. You just plug everything in. Everything's the same size. Everything plugs in the same. 6 liter. You could go all the way up to that if you wanted to. Well, that's going to be the end of us. We've been here 31 minutes and a half. Hope you guys made it all the way to the end, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for coming by.